Hey everyone, in today's video, I am interviewing the one and only amazing Natasha Crane about her book called Faithfully Different. You guys have no idea how many takes it took me just to get that one sentence out. Hey everyone in oh my gosh. I interviewed oh. Hey everyone, in today's This is literally like my 15th try. Of all the books that I have read recently, this is one that I keep grabbing off of my shelf to refer to. It's marked up, it's tabbed, and I can almost promise you that if you get this book, you'll be doing the same thing. The reason why I love this book and books like this is that they shine light on situations that are rather new for us as Christians. It's like a lifeline, and it gives us understanding of the world around us. And books like that really appeal to me as a Christian, as a mother, as a wife, and I think it will do the same for you too. I ask her about things in the book that I personally resonated with. But even then, getting into these topics, we can only go so far. There's so much more to know about these topics. And I will leave a link in the description where you can find this book, where you can order it. And I really hope that you enjoy this video. Natasha, I want to thank you so much for coming on today onto my channel and talking about this absolutely mind-boggling, amazing book, Faithfully Different. Thank you for writing this, and thanks for coming on.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. It's great to talk to you.
Yeah. So guys, I have talked about this book. I've quoted this book a few times. Having Natasha on to talk about her book today is such a treat because it had a big impact on me. I've marked up this book. I've read it. I highly suggest that you run out and get it. I will have a link in the description of the video. But today I'm going to ask Natasha about things that I resonated with the book personally. And there's a lot. This book is really dense. So I had trouble coming up with just a few questions for you, Natasha, but I first want to start with the practicality of the name of your book, Faithfully Different. That's the name of your book. And it does act like a practical guide to kind of navigate the times that we're in right now. And I think you do a really excellent job of laying out these issues in your book. Now, in describing those who are faithfully different, you mentioned those who have a biblical worldview. This was so surprising to me. But those who have a biblical worldview who are in a surprising minority. And you break it down, you bring the receipts, you explain how that's true. But those who identify as a Christian, but that doesn't necessarily mean, or there's those who identify as a Christian, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're Christian, which is funny because I just made a satire about that. You talk about the statistics about being faithfully different by having a biblical worldview. And how does that make us a minority?
Yeah, that's a really good question because it's misunderstood a lot. When people hear the popular statistics that get thrown out there, they usually hear the statistics that the Pew Forum has come up with. And so the Pew Forum is really widely known as the organization that tracks religious trends in America. And so they do these huge religious landscape studies where they research with tens of thousands of people to find out how do you identify in terms of your religious affiliation. And so the most recent one was done in 2019. And at that time, they found that 65% of Americans identify themselves as a Christian. And so if you hear that kind of number, and that's the number that usually gets thrown out there when people talk about this, you kind of think, well, of course, Christians aren't a minority. Like, why are you guys so paranoid that you're a worldview minority? And I'm well aware that people would hear that and go, this is ridiculous. You know, the majority of people are Christians, but you have to understand what that number means in its context. So this research is done by asking people not what do you believe specifically, or not what do you do in your life specifically, but how do you identify yourself? It's that simple. It's a label that people apply to themselves. So you could have, and in the book, I give a few different examples of people who might say, I'm a Christian when a researcher calls. You could have someone who maybe just grew up in a Christian home. And so that's the closest thing that they can think of on a list to what they might identify with, even though they're not a Christian in the sense.
Yeah, I call them check the box Christians.
Yeah, exactly. They're checking the box. Or you might have someone else who maybe has general values that are consistent with Christianity, but they don't have an active faith in Jesus. Or maybe somebody else is a follower of Jesus, but that can mean all kinds of things. What does it mean exactly to someone to follow Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or maybe you have someone who actually does have an active faith in Jesus based on what we would think from historic Christianity. So all those people could say that they're a Christian. So what we should be interested in is going beyond that and learning, what do people actually believe in America today? Because that's going to determine the kinds of things we see in culture and the trends that we see and what we see in our own churches.
Mm-hmm.
And so Dr. George Barna is known for doing a lot of this kind of worldview level research and looking at what people actually believe. And he's now the director over at Arizona Christian University's Cultural Research Center. And so they've conducted what's called the American Worldview Inventory. And when they use this whole battery of questions, so I think they use more than 50 questions to look at what do people actually believe and what are the behaviors that go hand in hand with those beliefs, that's what they use to categorize people in terms of their actual worldview. How do you see reality, not just what kind of label do you put on yourself?
Mm-hmm.
And here's what they find most recently. They find that 6% of Americans have a biblical worldview. And if you look at 18 to 29-year-olds specifically, that number is 2%.
Wow.
And so what you have is a huge gap between the 65% of Americans who say, yes, I'm a Christian,
But don't believe in
and
Christian things.
6% who actually have a functioning biblical worldview, who would adhere to basic tenets of truth that are taught in the Bible and live their lives accordingly. That's a giant gap. And just to throw one more statistic at you here that I think is so relevant, this is not just a problem in America in general, but within the church, they found that 21% of evangelical Protestants have a biblical worldview. 21%. So we're not just a minority in America. Wow. If you have a biblical worldview, you're a minority within the church. That has to really sink in and hit us. It's not even, you go to church on Sunday and you think, well, I'm surrounded by fellow believers, but believers in what exactly? Yeah. Because the research shows that only about 1 in 5 have what would be considered a functioning biblical worldview.
That is absolutely fascinating to me and sad at the same time. It's interesting though, because you're talking about statistics, and I noticed there's the statistic of like booming mega churches, and attendance is growing in the mega church culture, and like that culture, not just, one church. But people who identify as Christian, like biblical Christians, that's going down. And I find that to be very interesting. And there's something to that with researching that. And also it reminds me, it's almost like people identifying as vegan, like 65% of Americans that identify as vegan, but they eat meat. Then you're not a vegan.
That's a good comparison.
Why do you think so many people identify as Christian? Why is that? Especially in our today's culture, where Christians can kind of be looked at as oppressors. Why do you think so many people want to identify with that then?
That is a really good question. And it's an interesting question because 10 years ago, or I guess it's been now, when they did the same research, they found that 75% of Americans, or it might have been 77%, actually 77% of Americans identified as Christian. So that was just a decade ago. That kind of drop, that kind of shift from 77% to 65%. I mean, we might still think of that like, oh, it's still a majority. That's a huge percentage drop. That's not just a function of, research error, a few points either way. That's a major shift. So historically, Christianity has been the dominant religious influence in America. So you see that holdover of people who have identified as Christian because they likely had a family that at least nominally identified as that. But then the further that you go along, you get to the last decade, and we're seeing a giant drop in people who are willing to identify as Christian. And so I think that's really interesting. And I talk about that actually in the first chapter, that people overwhelmingly now are starting to drop the label, whereas in the past, maybe they were just as nominally Christian, but they were more willing to have the label. But I think we're going to see this continue to drop precipitously because it's no longer useful and helpful to people to identify with that anymore. It's no longer associated with, oh yeah, I'm a good person, I'm a Christian.
Yeah.
Now people look at you, if you say you're a Christian, they think you're actually bad. You're an oppressor. You have morally harmful beliefs. You want to hurt people, or even if you don't want to hurt people, you hurt people because of what you believe.
Yes.
And so the more that now people are starting to realize that, the more people are going to be walking away from the label. So I think that's going to just keep dropping and dropping. And part of that research had also shown from George Barna that the percent of people with a biblical worldview has dropped by 50% in the last 25 years.
Wow.
So that's huge. That's in terms of what people actually believe, not just the label, but in terms of what they actually believe, the number of people with biblical worldview has dropped by half in the last 25 years. So we're seeing a drop off of the actual beliefs, the actual worldview, and we're seeing a drop off of the label itself, just the nominal label. So in every way, our society is changing. And I try to really drive that point home at the beginning of the book and saying, you probably feel things are getting tougher for Christians. You probably feel the challenges today. Maybe you can't put your finger on exactly what's going on, but if you feel something's been changing rapidly, you're right. It absolutely has. And the statistics bear that out. So I think that we'll continue to see that drop off because fewer and fewer people are willing to call themselves Christian now. And it does depend on kind of your region of the country and that kind of thing, because we have kind of, regional cultures. And so that's going to change at different rates. But overall, I think that's going to keep dropping.
Yeah. And that's really interesting. That's kind of the whole aspect of your book is how to be. I like that you started the book with that, because that's really the foundation for it, is how to be faithfully different from everything else that's going around. And so that kind of brings me to my next question, which is on chapter 2 and kind of 3, but mainly 2 on secularism. I found it to be very fascinating and very memorable. I have quoted this part of the book in interviews and videos because it's so good. But you're talking about secularism as like an umbrella term for self-authority. And you call it an inescapable worldview. And you give an example of a board game, where we're all basically forced to play. Like, okay, well, y'all are making up the rules. I don't want to play with you, but you're like, what if you're forced to play this game, this game of life? And the rules keep changing based on popular consensus. And Christians want to read the rule book and stick with that, but nobody else cares about it. So, and you talk about Christians who are giving into this and kind of creating this hybrid rule book. Can you expound on this thought and how you have seen this in society?
Yeah. So let's back up just a little bit to do some definitions to make sure everybody's kind of on the same page with what do we mean when we talk about secular, because it can have a lot of different meanings and it's been used in different ways over time. So secular, probably in the most common way that people hear it, is a political term. So when you hear that the United States is a secular country, that means that our country does not defer to the authority of a particular religion in public life. So, yeah, and a lot of people misunderstand what that means. And so we can get back to that in a minute. But secularism in the United States actually was the very first country to explicitly establish itself as a secular country, that there is no state-supported church. We have freedom of religion. And so that was a secular country. But in the same way, an individual person can be secular in their worldview, and that they don't defer to the authority of a particular religion or God in their own life. And so secularism then is the worldview that we give to people, or not we give, but it's the name that we give to people whose view is that the authority is not a particular religion in their own life, but rather the authority is themselves. And I think this is such an important point to start with in this discussion, is just when you take away the authority of a God or of a religion in a person's life, it's not that they're left with no authority, they're left with the authority of themselves. And so I think the way that I put it in the book is that the tie that functionally binds the worldviews of millions of people today is the authority of the self, rather than the authority of any particular religion or God. And so that's a really important thing, I think, for Christians to understand, is that for us, our authority is not us in terms of what is the nature of truth, what's the nature of reality, what's the nature of what's right or wrong. Our authority is not what we want or what we think or what we determine. It's God. And God, as he has revealed these things through his inspired word. And so that's our authority versus the secular authority. So that's where this whole board game analogy comes in, because it's sort of like if you have a bunch of people playing a board game, And then you have the people who say, well, there's a rule book over here. And this rule book is going to tell us how we're supposed to play the game. This is the authority for how the game works and how we're supposed to play, what we should do, what's right or wrong in the game. And so there are some people who are looking at that and saying, well, let's figure this thing out. This is what we're supposed to do, right? And then there are other people who come into the game and they just start making up their own rules. They're going forward spaces when they shouldn't be,
Like
and they're
toddlers.
going backward spaces when it's like not their turn. And the people looking at the rule book are like, wait a second, you're totally doing this wrong in an objective sense, that you can't do it that way. That's not what the rules say. But all these people who have come into the game are looking at them like, who cares about the rules? Those are just some fun ideas that people had over time about how we can play this game, but that has no authority for how to do it. So we're going to do it our way. And then they all start talking together and they all start kind of coming to consensus on what they like the best and when they want to move forward on the game and when they want to jump across the level. And so you have this ongoing battle between the people who are like, this isn't how you play the game. This isn't what's right or wrong with the game. You have to look at the rules, versus all the people over here who are like, that's irrelevant. That's just some stuff people came up with. And so I say in the book, this would be really easy to resolve if this were just a board game. You just get up and walk away. But what if you can't get out of the game? What if this is everyday life in our culture, that we are going to continue to have this battle, and more and more people are going to join the game who say that rule book, and of course, this is a metaphor for the Bible, that rule book doesn't matter. And we don't care what you have to say. And not only that, but whoever came up with those rules over there, those are bad and harmful rules. So you need to go away. It's your opinion about how to play is not as valid as our opinion. You need to leave. And so I think that's really that metaphor, I think really helps to kind of think about what kind of situation that we're in today with the culture, because it's not just everybody's getting together with their own opinions and saying everyone's opinion is equally valid. It's we're getting together with people telling us that our rule book is stupid and that we're bad for accepting it. And meanwhile, there are a lot of Christians who don't know how to defend the rule book. That don't know how to explain to anyone else that, wait, but these are actually the rules from the creator of the game itself. And he has the authority to tell us how this should be played. He has the good and rightful authority. So there's a lot going on there, I think, that we can unpack, but that's kind of the gist of the board game analogy.
Yeah. And I like analogies because I find that people remember them very well. So I really wanted to zone in on that because I think people will find that to be memorable as well for what's going on in our society. And this springboards into another question, probably my favorite question and probably my favorite thing about the book in general was this theme that you repeated throughout the whole book. And I loved it. I've memorized it. I think a lot of Christians should memorize this and remember this and internalize it because it's so true to what we're seeing in our society. And it explains a lot of what we're seeing. But you say feelings are the ultimate guide. Happiness is the ultimate goal. Judging is the ultimate sin. And God is the ultimate guess. You repeat it in almost every chapter. You define this more in chapter 3, but can you talk about each one of these and break it down, why they're compelling and how they speak to our fallen nature?
Yeah. So after establishing in chapter 2 that the whole secularism as a worldview is really about the authority of the self, I try to elaborate on that because it's one thing to point that out, that it's all about the authority of the individual. It's another thing to explain, well, what does that mean in a practical sense? How does that logically play itself out in society? Because theoretically, if you hear, okay, well, a secular person, they're going to look to themselves to determine what's true, you can think, well, then we're going to have millions and millions of people with individual ideas about all of this. But you don't necessarily see that because there are some strong commonalities amongst people who think that they are their own authority. And so that's where these 4 tenets come from. If your authority is yourself, ironically, there are going to be 4 things that you're going to agree on with lots of other people whose authority is themselves. And the first one is, like you said, feelings are the ultimate guide. So just to start with that one, if you're the authority on what's true and what's right and all things in your life, if that's you, then your feelings are the only thing that are there to guide you. And no one, there's nothing external to you. It's only you. And so feelings then become the ultimate guide to your life. There's no one other than you that can tell you anything. You're the expert. And how much do we see this manifest itself in culture, right? We see the whole follow your heart literally everywhere. It's on mugs, it's on pillows, it's at every home goods store, it's on your grandma's inspirational towel. It's literally everywhere you go. You have to follow your heart. And it sounds like a cutesy saying that maybe, you think, oh, that's kind of, sometimes people take it seriously. Sometimes people think, oh, that's just kind of a nice thing to say, but it has a really serious underpinning worldview to it that people take as a matter of life and death, that feelings are my ultimate guide. I'm going to follow my heart because my heart knows what's true. Nothing and no one else will know what's true for me because I'm the authority. Feelings are the ultimate guide for everything. So that's where that really starts. But then we have to ask ourselves, okay, well, if feelings are my ultimate guide, where does that lead me? To what end? Where are they taking me? A guide takes you somewhere. And from a secular perspective, the overarching view is that happiness is the ultimate goal. So your feelings are guiding you toward the ultimate goal of happiness. And I find there's so much confusion for Christians on this because as Christians, our ultimate goal is not happiness. But a lot of people think that it is. Jesus told us to take up our cross to follow him. Like that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to feel happy in a circumstantial kind of sense along the way. You will find joy in the eternal hope that we have in Jesus. And that kind of joy is different than the happiness that the world sees. The happiness that the world is looking toward is no matter what the method is to get there, I want to feel happy in the end. If I decide that I want to leave my marriage behind and go and marry somebody else because that's what's going to make me happy, then that justifies anything I do to get there because happiness is the ultimate goal. And by the way, no one else can tell me that that goal is wrong because you're not inside of me. How can you know that my goal is wrong? Happiness is my ultimate goal. So however I define happy, that is what you need to support me in. And that goes to the third pillar here, which is judging as the ultimate sin. So if feelings are the ultimate guide and they're going to get you to whatever you define as happiness as your ultimate goal, then judging is the one thing that is bad. It's the ultimate sin. You cannot come along and tell me that anything is wrong with what I'm choosing because how would you know what makes me happy? You can't judge that. There's no external judgment. I'm the authority. See, all of these come back to I'm the authority. And something that I find so interesting about the whole judging as the ultimate sin, and we hear this all the time in culture, like don't judge me and you shouldn't judge. And even Christians totally get this wrong all the time. But the more that we hear from culture that judging is bad, the more that we feel we're in this untouchable cocoon ourselves, so that if anyone tries to criticize us or to critique what we're doing, we're like, you're judging me, and judging is bad. So that whole idea of judging being a sin also protects us if we kind of fall along this whole self-authority mentality, because we just start thinking, well, if anyone tells me there's something wrong with what I'm doing, well, they're in the wrong. It's not me. It can't be me. They're in the wrong. They're judging. Judging is bad. So you have these three pillars that go really closely together, the feelings and happiness and the judging. But then you might ask, like, okay, well, what about God? Where does God fit into this? And a lot of people misunderstand secularism and think that secular means atheist, but that's actually not the case. And actually more statistics, if you look at it, only about 10% of America doesn't believe in any kind of higher power at all. So flip that around, 90% of people believe that something is out there, whatever they might define that is. But that's okay in secularism. It is okay to believe in a generic God. What's not okay in secular culture is to believe in a specific one, a specific God who has revealed anything that might question our sense of authority. So if God has actually revealed himself in some kind of scripture, like say the Bible, that's threatening to our authority of the self. We don't want to believe that. And so God is the ultimate guess is the way that I phrase that, because for a lot of people, it's like, yeah, it's okay if you want to believe something. You just better not believe he's said anything that would have any requirement of me or any judgment of me. But if you want to believe there's like a creator out there and that he's kind of cool and like maybe you can even pray to him and he's going to make you happy sometimes, working toward happiness is the goal, that's okay. That's totally fine. But if he has revealed any kind of moral requirement or telling you how to live your life, that's not okay from a secular perspective.
Mhm.
So I think the God is the ultimate guess is really all about the fact that you cannot profess to have any confidence that you know who this God is or what he wants of us.
Mhm.
Because the second that God is more than just anyone's guess, that there's any kind of certainty about who he is and what he wants, that's when everything's off the table.
Yeah.
So when we look at all those pillars together, part of your question was, well, why is that compelling? And that's really what I focus on in chapter 3, because theoretically, if we're a worldview minority, we could be surrounded by people who have beliefs that we're like, okay, we'll see you later. Actually, that doesn't appeal at all. Right. So maybe there's not a lot of pressure that comes from the majority. But instead, what we see is that the worldview of people around us, this secularism, is actually very influential on Christians. And we're seeing that Christians are embracing all kinds of secular ideas. That's part of that whole gap between the 65% and the 6%, is that people don't have kind of a pure worldview. Not that anyone has an absolutely perfect worldview, but it is just pulling in people with a biblical worldview who want to have one. It's pulling in all of these secular ideas. And what's so interesting to me is that the Bible tells us why that is. And it says, the Bible tells us over and over that we want to go our own way as human beings. Basically, the Bible says we want the authority of the self. And so that's fascinating to me, because it's like the Bible tells us explicitly why what we see today is so compelling, even for Christians, because our very nature as humans is to want to turn away from God, to go our own way, to think on our own terms rather than to turn toward his authority. So it is a compelling worldview in particular that we're surrounded by. And I think that's why we need so much clarity today as Christians from a biblical perspective of what it means to believe and think and live differently. And so that's kind of how I structured the rest of the book, to address that. Now that we know we're a minority, now that we understand secularism is what surrounds us, and now that we see why it's so compelling because of our very human nature, now what? And then that's when I go into all the different pressures that we're facing today.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think maybe one reason why these chapters resonated with me so much is I'm an ex-New Ager. And if there's one core, it's like pinning down a cloud to define New Age, New Thought. People think New Age and they might think like 60s, but really it's not. It's the belief of the garden. It's the first lie told to mankind, really. And that you are your own sovereign. That's the core basis of New Age, is that you have itself. How would you think that secularism, would you think that secularism is related to New Age ideas in that aspect? Because they sound so similar.
Well, I think secularism is a big umbrella. I think of it as an umbrella worldview, because people can have tons of different beliefs, specific beliefs within that about the nature of reality. So you can have anything from the hardcore atheist who's super focused on, science and reason and evidence, supposedly being the opposite of religion and being super anti-religion in that way. You can have anything from that to someone who considers themselves very spiritual, not religious, and maybe takes on more of like a New Age view. It's still, even if a person believes that there's energy in rocks and has all these ideas that come from New Thought about what you can say and then make it true just because of, you're declaring it, like, even if you have all those types of beliefs, if ultimately the authority about reality is you, then you're going to have a lot in common with other people whose authority is the self. And I think that's maybe the most interesting things to me about looking at secularism and just looking at the ties that do bind everyone. It binds a lot of people with a whole lot of different beliefs about the way things work. But it's so ironic that with all these self-authorities running around, the popular consensus on a lot of moral issues comes right back together. Because when the authority is the self, then everything starts looking like whatever the group wants. And then that's where you start to see society to come together. Like, no matter what I believe about what may or may not be out there beyond the natural world, morality is going to look like what popular consensus says today. And everyone starts gravitating to that. It's kind of like a magnetic effect, because it becomes kind of it's the group, right? Everyone starts to move to the group, even though they're the authority of themselves, which is a fascinating kind of irony, I think.
Yeah, I think you shined a lot of light on that whole thing. And I think that's one reason why I found it so fascinating. The other chapter it was hard just to choose parts of this book. So guys, really, it's such a dense book. Like, even what we're going over right now, there's so much more, and it's so good. And well, the other chapter that I think really resonated with me that I wanted to focus on and ask you about is chapter 6. You talk about deconstruction, and this is a popular term in progressive Christianity. I don't think a lot of people they hear it, but I don't know if a lot of people understand it, or what that really means. But basically, it describes those who are re-examining their historic Christian beliefs in the name of spiritual seeking. And many times people end up just leaving the beliefs altogether. And we've seen this over and over again, especially with celebrities. And you've talked about that in your book. I have to admit, it was a tough chapter to read because it made my heart hurt. It made me want to pray for these people. It made me empathize, and it was tough in a good way to get through. And you mentioned how people who deconvert, they see this experience of deconversion as a liberating thing. Like it frees them. They're free from this oppressive system of Christianity, these moral limitations, these restrictions. And ultimately, it's like they become cultural secularists. What are your thoughts about how Christians can respond to this, and give some perspective on their supposed version of happiness when people deconstruct like this?
Yeah, I think this is a huge topic because so many people have gone public, and you see these headlines, of so and so, is leaving the faith, or is deconstructing. You see all these kinds of things. And one of the things that I'm really trying to hone in on in that chapter is to show people that those public deconversion narratives or deconstruction narratives, they are almost like reverse evangelism.
Yeah.
They are structured in a very specific way to not just make some kind of neutral announcement of, fact, like, hey, I'm just letting you guys know I'm not a Christian anymore, or, now I have these different beliefs, but rather to convince you to come along.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of Christians have really struggled after seeing people that they really looked up to, musicians or authors, people, Christian leaders that they looked up to as a mentor spiritually, whatever the case may be. And they're shaken by it. And so I think one of the reasons that they're shaken by it is because of the way that these narratives are crafted. And so in that chapter, I kind of walk through, there's a model. It's almost like they're all looking at the same playbook because there's a model for how these are presented. They say, okay, here's the catalyst. Basically, that's step one of it, of saying like, I finally realized how many problems there were with Christianity. And so I started looking into it. So it's always kind of this negative catalyst. And then you have what I call the avalanche of questions. So you have, like, almost invariably, they will list off 10 plus questions of saying, I really started thinking about it. And then I realized, why would a good God allow so much evil? And, what about the Old Testament God versus New Testament God? They seem so different. And how about the genocide of the Canaanites? And they just start going and going, and they list all these questions. A lot of Christians have never really looked into these challenges. They haven't studied them themselves. And so when they see the avalanche of questions come from people who have now decided to deconstruct or deconvert because of them, it's a powerful pressure on them, because they look at that and they're like, oh my gosh, those are good questions, and I don't know how to answer them. And apparently they looked into them and there were no good answers. And so that's kind of the impression that it leaves on Christians who really haven't gotten too deep into this aspect of their faith before, into any kind of apologetics. So the avalanche of questions is very powerful for a lot of people, even though realistically, there have been answers written and discussed for 2,000 years to all of these questions. Like, you're not brilliant because you suddenly realize there are bad things in the world and the Bible claims God's good. I mean, I don't mean to be overly sarcastic, but it's just reality. It's almost arrogant, really, to say like, oh, and what about this big question? These are big questions. They are difficult questions. So I don't trivialize that at all. But to make it sound like I'm deconverting because I had questions and no one could answer them, which is often the, implied answer to that, is just a bit of, I don't know. It's a bit disingenuous, I think, in some cases. So that's the avalanche of questions. And then it always ends with the happy ending. It's never, I get to the end of this and this is really hard for me to deal with and this kind of thing. I mean, once in a while, they'll acknowledge that it was a difficult process. But most of the time, what they want you to know first and foremost is, I'm free. I am so happy now. Guys, don't worry about me. Don't feel bad for me, because I am at peace. I am happy.
Mm-hmm.
Just realize with those tenets of secularism we were talking about earlier, happiness is the ultimate goal.
Mm-hmm.
So if happiness is the ultimate goal and someone feels happy because they're not a Christian anymore, that's almost like they expect it to be a self-explaining statement.
Mm-hmm.
Like they expect you to hear that and go, oh, well, then it must be okay. They're happy.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, wow. They're happy. Happy is the ultimate goal. And so for them, it's kind of like, it's almost like they think it's a mic drop. It's kind of like, guys, I'm happy. End of story. Like, and you should all realize that happiness is the goal. But for Christians, we should recognize that people can be happy, temporary happy, in all kinds of ways. You could, my husband works in homeless services. He's the chief operating officer of a large gospel rescue mission. And he sees a whole lot of people on the streets who refuse to get help because they are supposedly happy with their current state, living on the street, doing drugs and being out of their mind a lot of the time. So you can think that you're happy and you can consider it happy, but happiness is not the goal. Mm-hmm. Happiness is only a fleeting feeling. Of course, that's consistent with secularism because your feelings are the guide and your happiness is the goal. Mm-hmm. But as Christians, truth's not determined by what we think makes us feel happy. And I think that's, you asked, I'm giving you a long answer to how do we respond. Good, I think that's the really what to understand is that people who are deconverting are trying to make you think like, you need to consider this because I'm really happy now. In fact, I am so happy because I'm not oppressed. Mm-hmm. And realize what they mean by that. If they feel free from an oppressive system, what they're actually thinking they're free from is the authority of something external to themselves.
Yeah.
See, now they're back to, I just deconverted from the authority of God to authority of me. Mm-hmm. And as Christians, we need to recognize, of course, they feel happy because the Bible tells us that's exactly what we want as humans. We want to be on our own and go our own way. So they think that they are being freed from something because now they get to be detached and just be their own authority. In reality, if you are not under the good and rightful authority of God, you're just enslaved to a lie. So everyone is under the authority of God, whether they recognize it or not. And happiness doesn't determine whether or not something's true. So we have to just be aware that secularism is this very strong pull. When people publish these public deconversion narratives, they're trying to pull you in with it. And they're using all the same logic that the world uses to try to make you question your own beliefs. And they're trying to make you think, oh, I should follow this because I am happy. You need to be happy with me too. And everything's going to be okay in the end. And that's kind of the message that they're giving.
Yeah. Have you ever read Brave New World?
I haven't.
I just read it recently, and it was a book that we had the option of reading in high school. I just read it. It was poetic. I expected it to be more of a narrative, but in this book, Huxley has it's just one big satire of what would happen if we actually got world peace. It's a very interesting piece. Yeah, the people kind of quoted alongside of Orwell. And in his book, he has something that he calls soma. And what people do is they take soma and live off of soma, which is basically a feel-good high all the time. And there's a character that he's by no means a hero, but he's a character in the book that he presents as refusing to be a part of that society. He's like, because basically everybody's living in this lie and he can't live like that. That's kind of what it reminds me of, is that there's this element of where even if we have to sacrifice truth on the altar of happiness, we'll do it to get our happiness. We don't care what's true because that costs us something. And I find that very interesting. And that's what it reminded me of as you were speaking. This is very insightful. This has been wonderful and great. I have waited for this interview for weeks since I finished this book. And guys, I can't recommend this book enough. This is honestly, I did a top 10-ish book recommendation like a few months ago. And I don't think I had fully finished this book yet before I did that. But this would have been 100% on that list. And also as in the section of my recommendations that had like a profound impact on me, it was one of those books, so I can't recommend it enough. I will leave a link in the description where you can get the book. and Natasha's socials as well. And Natasha, before we sign off, is there anything else that you want to say to my viewers that you think that they should know?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me on, and thank you for the kind recommendation. I really appreciate it. I think that I would just want to encourage people, because I think we can get down when we are talking about all these things and public deconversion narratives and how much Christianity is shrinking and all this stuff. But ultimately, I hope that the book strikes a chord of encouragement, that this is also an opportunity to be salt and light, to be a distinct light to the world. And what we want is not to just be an extension of secularism, which a lot of us are right now, but rather to be that distinct light. And there are so many opportunities that we have now to be able to shine light in a world that is becoming dark. Mm-hmm. And so I just want to encourage people that we shouldn't feel the discouragement of all of this, but rather to accept that this is what Jesus said it would be like. We've been a little spoiled in the past, that kind of our culture generally had kind of values that were consistent with what we believe. Now those are going away, and we need to pull up our pants, and we need to be ready to make a case for and defend the truth of Christianity, to not be afraid to speak up about God's truth in the world. Rather than preserving our ease, we need to preserve God's truth. That's what it means to be salt and light. And so we have many, many opportunities now to do that. And it's time for us to. So that should be sort of an exciting thing, that we're here for a reason at this time and place. And I hope that this book will help people to do that.
Yeah, amen. For such a time as this. Thank you again, Natasha. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.